Okay. Yeah, I noticed in my recordings that what I should do is give some intro, but I guess I won't. We're we're at well, it's almost like I'm trying to go from week to week and make at least continuous, but hopefully it's continuous in your mind. But I was looking at myself, I'm like, what? This is just seems like it's just starting. But anyway. Um, we're at Jesus, the bread of life. And I think this is interesting because, and I thought it was really good how the pastor did it today in his sermon. He listed the living water things in John, right? And that's what I am trying to get you to see, well, us to see, right, as we go through John, that I thought that was a proper way to look at it. You can look at it like, okay, here's the baptism, and here's Nicodemus talking about, being born of water and blood. And although I don't think that's really baptism at all. That's not what it meant, because the concept of baptism wasn't even within that context at all with Nicodemus. But then there is a constant theme of water, and then we have the theme of, and the Spirit, by the way, which is really important, pneuma. And then we have, the Samaritan woman who's living water, like water there, and then, the water at the mikvah, so we are trying to put those ideas together, although it's our problem is we don't have that Greek mind. I was rereading in Aristotle, I think I mentioned this to you, that Aristotle talks about a good plot has to be contiguous in your brain. And we know that our brains are only good for what? 60 seconds, 30 seconds, a commercial. We can't hold a plot longer than that. But the Greeks could probably hold a plot of about an hour or so. So they thought a good Greek drama, maybe, an hour, and then change the plot around a little bit, right? So Anagon. But most of it can't even, contemplate that. So, here the gospel writer, John, is giving us not a plot necessarily, but a historical point with logos to tell us. And he's giving us all these beautiful logos to tell us, and we can't hold it all in our brain all at once. But he would expect us to. So that's what we'll try to do. But in this case, we have the circumstance of Jesus feeding, and how does that tie into water? Water is really interesting in this whole context because the water was the Sea of Galilee, right? And he showed power over the world, over the water, over the gods, and all this other stuff. But we have it within this context of bread and food, which I can't get over the point that there is no other God that fed the people ever in the history of all of the world. Jesus is the only God who fed the people, which really blows me away. And then we get to this point, which is John. Remember, we have a historical account, and then we have John using dialogue to bring out that logical point, and that's what this is. So, I leave the NIV titles, which is okay. I mean, I don't think they're really pertinent per se, but it puts it in the context. So we're 25. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? And if you remember, the disciples were heading toward Capernaum from wherever the feeding was, where they fed the 5,000. It was apparently on the other side of the lake. We don't know exactly where that was. We were trying to determine on our own. But the disciples were going back to Capernaum, sneaking home without Jesus. And Jesus was out in the mountains. And then Jesus walks on the water to them in the storm, where he shows his power over the gods, etc. And then there are the people in Tiberias. You go, well, how does Tiberias get in this picture? So the ships from Tiberias were going across to the people. I guess they saw a market opportunity or some kind. And then they're heading to Capernaum to look for Jesus. And so that's where we find him. Apparently, they found him in Capernaum, and this is where they found him on the other side of the lake. They asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? and then the Greek, that's what's always fun, right? The King James says, when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? So in the Greek, and they having found him through the thalassus of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, at what time in this same spot have you been caused to be? This is that. This is not the identity verb; it's the cause to be verb, which is usually translated is in our Bibles. So the translation, and they having found him across the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, at what time in the same spot have you been caused to be? What is interesting about this is, okay, remember, where did Jesus live? Capernaum. Yeah. Capernaum, in more than one gospel, it says that Jesus lived in Capernaum. And Capernaum is where the disciples, apparently, Peter and his brother and his father had their shipping, their fishing industry in Capernaum. And what's really interesting about this is his rabbiship, right? From the very beginning, we know, I don't think it says it before, but it says when he went to the wedding at Cana, right? He was a rabbi. They said he was a rabbi. So where's your rabbi? He's a rabbi in Capernaum, which is really interesting. So he has, and Nicodemus acknowledged him as a rabbi. So Jesus had, was an affiliated specific structure of being acknowledged as a rabbi, and probably in Galilee. Now, I'll remind you, if you don't remember, but what's the big deal about being a rabbi in Galilee? Any thought? There are 4 schools, rabbinic schools. There's 4 schools, rabbinic schools. One is the school of the Galil. One is the school of Jerusalem. One is the school of Alexandria. And the last is the school of Babylon, the Babylonian school. And the Babylonian school and the Jerusalem school both wrote down they wrote the Mishnah. They wrote the Talmud. Now, what would that tell you about the Jerusalem and the Babylonian school right away?
Progressive?
Yeah, progressive is a beautiful word. Because remember, what did the Pharisees, what did you not do with the Mishnah? Didn't write it down. It's unwritten law, right? That was passed down, supposedly, and guess who didn't believe, who did not trust it, didn't believe it? The Sadducees. The priests did not trust or believe in the written, the oral Torah, the Mishnah. But the Pharisees all held to it. But in the 4 schools that you have, only the progressive schools would have wrote it down. It's a good idea. I'm glad they wrote it down because, not that it would have been lost in obscurity, but the fact that it's written down and then the Talmudic, the Talmudic reasoning around it was written down is great because now, since this is a thing about, about not literary, but about the ability to read and write, about reading and writing. Right? Once you can write it down, you've set a stick in the sand. You've set a marker, right? Because, Homer, for example, Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, or Beowulf, the Skalds learned it by rote. Well, what do musicians and Skalds usually do with what they have?
Poetic justice.
Yeah, so let's fix this iambic pentameter and make it right. Now, sometimes you would get killed by the crowd because they go, oh, you recited it wrong, you sang it wrong, right? But in general, if you bring it to, let's say, a new village that had never heard Beowulf before, they go, oh, that's great, right? And your improvements, may have made it even better, right? And so how do you know it's not changed? But if you put a stick in the ground and you write down Beowulf, which they did, right? They wrote down Beowulf. Now I have a measure. And so when they wrote it down, this was really good, I think, for history. However, which is the least progressive school of the rabbinic schools? Remember? It's the school of the Galil. So Jesus was a rabbi from Galilee, and everyone presumed that he was in the most conservative school. That's why they always asked him the questions. And I don't remember in John if we get a lot of those questions that the Pharisees always ask. You know, can you divorce your wife for any reason? Can you, the adultery thing, can you save someone on the Sabbath? We do get those things, but in the other Gospels, we have those questionings, right? And the reason they're asking the questions is because those questions they know what the school of the Galil believes, and so they're pounding Jesus to make him, put him on record, let's say. And he never gives them the answer they're looking for. They want him to say, oh yeah, you can divorce your wife for any reason. That's what the school of Galil said. And he gives them a different answer than they're expecting from him, from that school. So anyway, I think this is really important. And so, we have him acknowledged as a rabbi, and then Jesus answers him. And here's where we're getting into that dialogue. I think it's beautiful dialogue because it's explaining, remember, this is explaining the logos to telos of the whole point of the feeding the 5,000. And Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, you're looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. And this, okay, let's see what it says in the Greek, because I think this is a really important point. Jesus answered and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek not because ye saw miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Ap Corinthe, he concluded for himself to them, Jesus, and he said, Amen, amen. I make a logical argument to you. You seek to worship or plot me, not because you stared at the semea, the indications, the supernatural ceremonial indications, the signs, all other things contrary-wise, that are because you ate from out among the arton, the loaves, and you were foddered, supplied food in abundance. And then, so this is the translation. Jesus concluded for himself to them, and he said, firm, firm, amen, amen, I make a logical argument to you. You seek to worship me not because you stared at supernatural ceremonial indications, contrariwise, because you ate from out of the loaves that you were foddered. He basically, we don't have this in our language. We don't do this, but other languages do, like German. German, if you want to tell somebody to shut up, you say halt mal. Halt mal. The reason you say halt mal is because German has a word for an animal's mouth, which is a maul, and they have a word for a human mouth, which is a mund. So if I said halt mund, that's very pleasant, and I'm telling you to close your mouth. But if I tell you halt mal, I just called you a animal, and I said shut your animal mouth. Most languages do this. Yes, sir.
Is that like Essen and Fressen? My German pretty rusty.
Yeah.
About animals eating and people eating. Is that one of those?
There are two different verbs for animals to eat, like this, fodder, right? And to eat. So both words are used here. Ephagete, you ate. That's what you'd say for humans. And es gotaste, you were foddered. So this, Japanese does this. Matter of fact, a lot of the Asian languages and some American Indian languages use different words for male and female. That is, the males use different verbs and words, and females use different verbs and words, both to refer to themselves and to refer to other men and women. So it's just, languages and culture are really interesting. And that's one of the reasons it's really cool to see this. But you can really insult a person in another language by using an animal verb or an animal noun to describe their body parts or their whatever. And it's used classically as ways of being mean or whatever, teasing or cursing or whatever, or a person. But Jesus says specifically here, and notice, you would think that the most important thing was that they saw these signs, right? The semeion, the ceremonial supernatural indications, because he did something amazing. The other thing that they're not talking about, that Jesus probably is really disappointed about, is the whole purpose of their getaway, of the offsite, right? The whole point of the offsite was, I told you, he set up a symposium, and at the end, he had the disciples pick up the food, because Jesus, the implication is that Jesus at the symposium wanted to express ideas to them. And then at the end of the symposium, what do you always do?
Banquet.
Yeah, what did you learn, right? What did you figure? What did you get from this thing? You don't want to pay a whole day's salary to everybody to take them to the offsite, and all they did is eat lunch, right? What did you learn? And so that, I think, is an unstated telos, but the setup is beautiful in the Greek, so we know that's what he was doing. And so Jesus didn't ask him, what did you learn? There's an implication here, right? What did you learn? You got fed, you had lunch, but you didn't even notice what was going on around you, really, is what he's kind of saying. The next one says, do not work for the food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, for on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Now here's some really fun stuff. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth into everlasting life, which Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. And here's the Greek. Let's see it. See it all here. You toil, which is interesting, because this is usually it's dynamos, but ergastethe, may, not or least. This is I need to discuss the uk versus may at some point, but I'm not going to do it right now. The eating, the being destroyed fully. Other things, contrariwise, the bros and the eating, the motion to stay, to or into life, aeonin, perpetual. Who, which, what, the huios, the offspring of the anthropo, of the man face, to you, those I will give him, assigning a reason, the Father, let's see, he has stamped for security or preservation the theos, the God. Let's see what that is. You're putting it into normal English. You toil not for the eating that is being destroyed fully. Contrariwise, for the eating that stays into life perpetual, which the offspring of the man will give to you, assigning a reason, that God the Father is stamped for security or preservation. What is really important looking at this is, you say, well, what does this mean? Okay, the eating, remember, what did he do at the end? They picked up the remaining food. It says so that it would not be destroyed completely. And I told you that was like code word. The point was not the food that was leftover, but rather that's a code word telling you that he was having the disciples talk to them and ask them, what did you get out of the symposium? What was your feedback, right? Fill out your form that says, what you liked about it. Was the atmosphere right? Did they have good audio visuals, right? That's what you have to always fill out. Jesus wanted to get the feedback because the things that were being destroyed fully is just the food. But the thing that was into life perpetual was there's two parts. One was the miracle, the sign, the thing that happened that, this is kind of, you notice this is all unstated. It's not like it's not there. It's all there. It's just that the author isn't telling us like we want in English, like this, right? Into a funny conclusion. So you want, well, tell me what it is. What are you trying to tell me? No, the Greeks don't do that. The Greeks aren't necessarily using all code words, but they expect us to get it out of the entire point, the logos that's being made. And so the logos here is, okay, what was being destroyed fully was the food. What was not is the two things. The things of life perpetual. Number one, what Jesus talked to them about in the symposium. And number two, the miraculous sign where Jesus used his power to take these loaves and fishes and make them into enough food for 10,000, 20,000 people to eat. To me, that's, all right. How could you not bring this as a takeaway, right? That we all go, how could they miss the main point here, right?
If 10,000 people were all aware of what was happening where Jesus was, because probably can't all see him at once unless they're all just talking about it amongst themselves. How the news spread to them.
Well, that's why it was a symposium, right? And we see in Matthew, we go back and look at the similar account in Matthew. It may be the same account, maybe the similar account. We don't know. But in Matthew, they divided them into groups of 50, I think, or something like that. Obviously a setup for a symposium. You divide them into groups of 50 so that you can then communicate with them in a reasoned fashion. The whole point is, I don't think anyone could miss the point. They weren't the cheesemakers. Did he say cheesemakers? Remember that Life of Brian? I really do think that's a very beautiful point because it's like a Greek irony, right? We say it's sacrilegious. No, it's a Greek irony. The Greeks would say this is wonderful. What did he say? What did he say? I think Jesus made sure, and it wasn't because of a miracle per se, but how could you not know, right? There's no food. We're hungry. And yet now there is food. And what are you going to ask? Okay, if I bring you a loaf of food, like a little loaf, or I bring you a fish, you go, oh, thanks, that's lunch. But what if I bring you broken bread, right? And broken fish? You kind of go, what's your first question?
Where's the butter?
Yeah, where's the butter? Well, why was it broken? Right? I mean, if you get your box lunch and you open it up and it's all broken up, you're either a child and they've cut it for you to fit it, or what do you say? Who's been in my lunch? Everybody, I think, knew how, knew by word of mouth and asked the question. Again, this is the unstated telos that the Greek writer would say, don't you get it? I mean, this is obvious, right? He would say, put yourself in this same position. And what would you ask? Who's been messing with my lunch? Right? I would. It'd be kind of bothersome, especially if you found mayonnaise already on your sandwich, right? Yeah. You toil not for the eating that is being destroyed, contrariwise for the eating that stays in the life perpetual, which the offspring of the man will give you, assigning a reason that God the Father has stamped for security or preservation. Now, I want you to note this. Look what he said. He uses all these interesting key points. He talks about the offspring of man. I like, the Son of Man is what we usually translate that as. Assigning a reason, the God, not just the God, the Father. The God, the Father, has stamped for security or preservation. What is a stamp for security or preservation? Here's something that, I don't know, you may have all known this. These are, they're called Beulah, by the antiquities dealers in 1975. They've tried to get these back because we don't know this, but back in ancient, especially ancient Levant, especially Israel, apparently Israel, Egypt. We're not so sure that the Greeks did this in the same fashion, but they may have. We don't, there's not that much evidence. But, and I'm not, it's really hard to tell why in their society this was such a big deal. But stamps for security or preservation. Today we'd say, oh, they stamped my milk with the expiration date, right? Or my medicine. Well, these aren't necessarily for expiration date. These are seals that are placed on food, preservation, stuff. And you say, oh, there's not many. No, it's enormous. Remember when they sealed Jesus' tomb? You think, oh, that was really special, right? Nope. They sealed everything. So much so that there were antiquities dealers, you could buy these in 1975. They're considered today to be, very valuable, very important historical commodities, because each seal, a lot of these seals, if you look, you see here's the obverse and the reverse. So the seals themselves are probably, these are in clay. So maybe from like a ring or from a pendant where you sealed something. And if you notice on some of these, you see on the back, they were sealed and then they were wrapped around a piece of rope or thread to seal the item. And so we know we're not exactly sure how all this worked. We just know that this was a very, very important and common part of their society. And so look back at the verse. It says, God the Father has stamped for security or preservation. So this goes back to what I told you. Who expects their meal, their box lunch at your offsite to be already opened and all the food to be done up? Because what you expect when you get your box lunch, I'm putting it in 21st century terms, is it to have a seal on it, right? But what is the seal on? What's the implication of the seal? And what kind of seal is it?
That it's good, that it's
That hasn't been tampered with.
Yeah, but what part has not been tampered with? The food was obviously tampered with. What part has not been tampered with? What part shows the seal of God? Well, his words, the fact that he did a miracle, right? The fact that he did a sign, a supernatural indication. I mean, who else could take 5 loaves and 2 fishes or whatever it was and turn it into enough food for 20,000, 10,000 people? I mean, that's just amazing. The other thing is, you notice the verbiage. It says life perpetual, and it talks about the offspring of man, right? The offspring of man is the Messiah, the Christus. That's the part that the Samaritan woman, and I think it's really cool that they have the Samaritan woman, right? The Samaritan woman is the smartest person in the Bible next to Jesus. She knew right away, we are looking for the Messiah, the Christus. Use both terms, right? Both the Hebrew and the Greek term for Christ. And she knew right away that's what they're looking for. What about these people? What are they looking for, ultimately? The Christus, right? Now, I don't think Jesus made a mistake by feeding them. But what are they mistaking?
they didn't see the bigger picture.
Yeah, they're mistaking a full belly
Right.
for what they're really looking for.
They're focused on their near-term mortal issues, not the long-term.
Yeah, exactly. And do you see what John just did to us, for us? He is, this Logos Tetelos is all about this. So the same thing's true in the manna in the wilderness, right? So in the wilderness, God gave them manna. God gave them quail. In this case, Jesus gave them fish and gave them bread. And they get the same reaction, right? In the wilderness, they died, right? They complained and they died. Only the next generation outlived through the wilderness. Everybody, it says everyone who had been previously, except for I think 2 guys, right? All died in the wilderness. So these are parallels. These are allegories. Allegory is not the right real word. It's parallels. Parallel is a better word. In other words, you're having a parallel historical situation that is in a different context that is supposed to draw your brain to this Logos Tetelos. We call Logos Tetelos the conclusion, right? The unstated conclusion of the point. And it's just, to me, it's pretty astounding. They asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Now, this is an interesting embedded statement itself. They said to him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? They said, and here's the Greek, they said, okay, they didn't think about it, did they? Remember? Apikrinthe means they concluded for themselves. They thought about it before they answered. They didn't think about it. They said, certainly, accordingly, pro forward to him, who, which, what must we do to make in order that we may acquire by labor the toils of the God. Accordingly, they said forward to him, what must we do in order that we may acquire by labor the toils of the God? I think this is really interesting. Are they interested in labor? Not really. And the word is interesting because you usually get dynamatos, but we have ergazomethe, which is the word up above also, same. And we have erga, toils. It's cool. So let's see what else it goes on, because there's much more in the word. Jesus answered, the work of God is this. The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he has sent. Okay, Apikrinthe, he concluded for himself. In other words, he thought about it before he answered. So it's a logical conclusion to Jesus, and he said to them, Ishiet, it is. There's an identity for him. The ergon, the toil of the theo, hina in order that, pisteoete, you should be persuaded, convinced of a logical argument, to or into, who, which, or what, apostylon, he has set apart, ekainos, that one there. Okay, this word is the basis for apostle, apostolos, apostle. He has set apart. Jesus concluded for himself and said to them, it is the toil of the God in order that you should be persuaded, to whom he set apart, that one there. I think this is really important. Sometimes we call this a work of salvation. And by the way, this may be the thing that, when we talk about work, right, works, we concluded that there is no work required for salvation. But what did Jesus say? What work is required? What is the work of God? That you, and this says believe, but it's not believe, it's pisteo. The work of God is that you should be persuaded, convinced of a logical argument, to whom he set apart, that one there. So remember all those fights back in the era of the Reformation? Is any work required for salvation? The Catholic Church said that, well, what is the work that's required for salvation?
To believe.
To be convinced. Yeah. We say believe, but that's really not a good Greek word, or that's a, what do you call, anglicized, Anglo-Saxon word in English. It's really to be convinced, because that's what pisteo means in Greek. But what is the work of salvation? What is work? What work's required? To be persuaded. If you're persuaded, it's perfect, right? I don't know. This is the huge fight that we always had. And matter of fact, Brock and the evangelicals, because we are an evangelical church, right? They argue that the problem with the Reformation is the reformers went way too far. And I'm not trying to make a theological comment here. I'm just pointing out that this is very interesting in a context, because Jesus himself says the work of God, right? And many times we want to conclude that's after. But these people are they believers? I don't know. That he is trying to convince them to the appropriate point, right? So I'm just throwing that out. I think it's really an interesting point. Jesus, that's what Jesus concluded. And so what does it say next? So they said to him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? We want lunch, right? Where's our box lunches? They said therefore to him, what sign showest thou then that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? Let's see what it says in the Greek. They said, Cornelius certainly to him, who, which, what, why? Cornelius certainly, etc. Un is a really interesting word in Greek, because they love to begin that or with and. What is it? You make or do, you Simeon, a sign, supernatural or ceremonial indication, in order that we may stare, idomen, we may stare at, and pistomen, we may be convinced of a logical argument. You, who ergaze, do you toil, acquire by labor. Accordingly, they said to him, accordingly, they said to him, accordingly. You notice, was there any thinking going on here? Apparently not. What supernatural ceremonial indication will you make in order that we may stare at and we may be convinced of a logical argument? What do you toil, acquire by labor? And I write here, this is a trick question. The trick question, right? The trick question is, he already showed them a sign, an amazing sign. And he already told them, right? What do you toil? Jesus told them what you need to do for God, in other words, the labor of God, right, is you need to be convinced of me, of the one he sent. And do you see the implication here? What did the Samaritan woman immediately know?
Christus. Messiah.
Yeah, you are the Christus. What about these guys? They're not making the connection. Right? This is what I worry about the disciples. The disciples are, you see what the disciples, why Jesus got mad at the disciples, right? There's the implication. Why did the disciples run away to Capernaum at the end of this thing? Because it says that the people wanted to make Jesus the basileus, right? And probably the disciples are on that team. They're like, yeah, we'll make him king. And then we have lunch every day, and we'll have offsites. It'll be really fun. No, Jesus' whole point is, hey, look, that is not my purpose, and the purpose of the Christus. Although, they believed, right, and we got to put ourselves in this century, in the first century, right? Jesus told them before, in every generation you had a Messiah. Why? Because the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees had bunches of messiahs. They were high priests and kings. What happened to them? They died, right? And Jesus comes and, unfortunately, we are usually not taught or read the Apocrypha. But the Apocrypha is all about the Messiah, coming Messiah. The Old Testament has a lot of implied ideas about the Messiah, but they're not easy to dig out. You know that. People who've studied them, if you've studied it, you go, yeah, this, in Hebrew, you really got to get into the Hebrew. You got to really get deep into it. And you go, okay, I can see. But remember, Hebrew is very euphemistic. It's a euphemistic kind of language. So it's, you can read some whole things one way or another, and which one is right? Both, right? That's what the poets will tell you. Which interpretation of your poem is right? Well, both, or all of them, whatever you find. Many times they'll say, because poets. You ever written poetry? I hope you wrote poetry. When you write poetry, what are you trying to do? Put many meanings into a single text that apply to your unstated telos, or even your stated telos in some of the poetry that people write today. The point is that when you write these things, especially the euphemistic ones, well, it's really hard to tell. We read prophecies, and it's really fun when you look back in retrospect and you say, hey, these happened. You look at the apocryphal documents and you go, these are pointing to a Messiah, to a Christ. Well, what did he look like? The Maccabeans said he was the high king and the priest. But guess what? None of the Maccabeans were legal priests. They weren't in the lineage of Aaron, and they weren't legally the king because they weren't in the lineage of the king, of the priesthood, of the kings, of David. But you have Jesus. You have Jesus. Very interesting, right? In Matthew, we get his lineage through his father, and he was, I'm trying to remember, Luke has his mother's lineage, and I think through Luke, he's more to the kings. In Matthew, he's more through the priesthood. But it may be the opposite way around. The point is that Elizabeth, right? His mother's related to his mother, to Mary. Her husband is Zechariah, who is a priest in the lineage of Aaron. So you have Jesus, who has both from David and from the priesthood. None of the Maccabeans can make that claim. So I don't know, this is all from that apocryphal period. But here's what it says. Accordingly, they said to him, accordingly, what supernatural or similar indication will you make in order that we may stare at and we may be convinced of a logical argument? What do you toil, acquire by labor? Our ancestors, and here you go, our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And if you remember, the point of the beginning of this whole argument was about the Passover. The Passover directly led to the manna events in the wilderness. Our fathers eat manna in the desert, as it's written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And remember, okay, when you do the Passover, the Seder, right? The remembrance of the Seder, the remembrance of the specific remembrance of the Seder is you're remembering that you were slaves in Egypt and that God let you out. And what's the point of the Seder? So the firstborn don't die. Remember, you had to sacrifice the lamb. You had to put the blood on the doorpost in a sign of a cross, which is really interesting in itself, right? You put the blood on the doorpost, head and both arms, sides, and that would allow the angel of death to pass over, right? The Passover. But the Seders, you remember that you were slaves and that you were rescued by God. Rescued to what? Now you're in the desert. and God provided manna. And if you remember, they're going to have the whole thing from the Old Testament about the water, right? I think at Horeb, where Moses provided water, or God provided water through Moses for the people. So, you know, this is all together. It's all focused together in this argument, this discussion.
Or also, they had to eat quickly. That's another reason on the Seder meal where because of the bitter herbs and so forth, they had to eat quickly to leave. I can't remember what the symbolism there was.
You're absolutely correct. They were supposed to eat it dressed, ready to travel, right? With their robes tied and their staff in their hand or something like that, right? And they were supposed to eat it quickly. We think later on it became less of a eat quick kind of thing, but you're totally correct. In the Torah, that's what it tells them to do, to remind themselves that they were then leading into the wilderness, right? Yeah, the whole thing. Because I probably don't have to remind you this because you guys are really smart about this, but you know, when you think about it, it's not, these things are not in isolation, right? Historical things and these historical incidents and these things that God has given them to do are not isolated. In other words, you don't have a Seder just to remember the fact that you were slaves in Egypt and that you built the pyramids or whatever you did, right? The whole point of the Seder is to remember the Passover of death, the firstborns. It's a sacrifice. You eat the lamb so that then you can be cast out by the Egyptians, or put it another way, rescued by God from the Egyptians into the wilderness. And then when you're in the wilderness, what is God doing? Taking care of you, right? So it's very, as I said, the Greeks would love this, right? We want the book. We want the book form. We want the novel to tell us all the points so we understand everything there is to understand about this.
Cliff notes.
The Cliff Notes, yeah. Give me at least the Cliff Notes, yeah, so I can figure this out. But the reality is these are intertwined, totally intertwined. So therefore, at the beginning of this, John tells us the Passover was at hand, and then we get Jesus feeding the 5,000, and now we get Jesus talking, and what do they bring up? The manna in the desert that was written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. What do they want from Jesus? Bread from heaven. The pateros, the fathers of us, the manna, ephajon, they ate in the Eremo, the lonesome place, the wilderness. Kathos, just as, according to manner in which it is gremenon, to graven, written. This is, I love the Greek for, you know, to them it's graven. It's graven, it's written. Arton, ek. From out or from among the Arano. Okay, this is really interesting. From out or among of the Arano, he gave to them to eat. You see a problem with there in the Hebrew and in the Greek view and in Jesus' view too. So that God gave it out of the Arano. Does God give anything out of the Arano? No. God gives out of the epi-Arano. In other words, what are they equating God to here? They're equating, yeah, to the Greek gods, right?
Earthly gods.
Yeah, because now do you see this? This is all connected. Okay, Jesus, the gods, right? It said the gods, the wind gods, the god of the Thalassa, probably Poseidon, who knows? Maybe they have a local god. They were all conspiring against Jesus, and what did Jesus do? Gave him a beat down, you know, told him, hey, go bother somebody else, right? he overcame the gods. And yet, in this, they're stating, quite incorrectly, that the God gave them manna from out of the dwelling place of the gods. In other words, from the Arano, right? From the creation. Miracles don't happen. I'll give you C.S. Lewis. Miracles don't happen from within the creation. The reason they're miracles is because they come from without the creation. The creation is what it is. You can't do much with the creation other than science, right? Science says, can I make food? Can I divide food and make it into something enough to feed 20,000 people? No, it's impossible. What that requires is a miracle, a sign, a semeion, a ceremonial indication or a supernatural sign, which Jesus did. And so it didn't come from the Arano. It came from the epi-Arano, from God. Okay, I know these are real details, but a Greek reader would go, aha, I get this. I'm seeing this, right? We get our translation. Here it is. Our fathers ate manna in the lonesome, just as it was written, loaves from out of the sky, the dwelling place of the gods, but not of God. He gave them to eat. So they're already starting with an error in their reason. Yes, sir.
Well, just stepping back a step, Jesus has just told them the work of God is to observe the evidence, think about it, and reach it. Telos, basically, your conclusion. That's how you're persuaded. And so they're saying, well, we don't have enough evidence after just what just happened. So it's like, we need more evidence. Our forefathers had evidence. Where's our evidence? And it's kind of like, hello, where were you for the last day? Basically.
Yeah. It's a recursive argument. I think if we were Greeks in this time especially, we even get this stronger. But we've read this. I've read this, account a bazillion times. We read John, we read the account, we go, okay, feeding the 5,000, whatever, right? You read it and you read it and you read it and you go, well, what new can I find in this? There's beautiful new stuff in this. It's just, it's like the Greek way. You just got to look at it from the Greek point of view and the first century point of view. And all of a sudden, I think your synopsis of that is perfect because, Jesus just showed them this sign. This is a miraculous sign from the epi-Aranos. And they're still bleating. They're bleating about, oh, hey, we need some more manna here, baby. Come on, give us some box lunches with a seal on it this time. I just think it's really funny. So we get Torah allusions and quotes. Let's see. I should probably go through this because we can continue this next week too. The whole Israelite community set out from Elpham and came to the desert of Sin, which, by the way, we kind of have this in some of the readings today, or very close to it. The 50th day of the second month after they come out of Egypt, presumption years, they came out of Egypt, that was the Passover. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we died in the Lord's hand in Egypt, then we sat. Okay. This is not Greek, but this is Hebrew, and the Hebrew is full of beautiful euphemism. They almost did die of God's hand, right? They had to have the Passover. This is unstated in there, but you're supposed to remember all this stuff. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you brought us out in this desert to starve us. If the Greeks had this document, which they did in the Septuagint, the irony is amazing. What did they do in the Passover? They roasted lamb, right? Until they burst. You had to eat it all, right? So they ate roasted lamb until they burst. And then, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve our entire assembly to death. Beautiful irony. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'll rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I'll test them and see whether they will follow my instruction. What did all those people, the 10,000, miss? The whole point of the manna was not just to feed them, but to see if they would follow his instructions. I think that's very interesting. And et cetera talks about this. And the instructions were, and they actually had somebody who didn't follow the instructions. Let's see. They had somebody that went out on the, let's see.
20.
Yeah, 20, is it in 20? We'll get there here. It says, when the Israelites saw it, they see. In the evening, quail came down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost, the ground appeared. That was the manna. Then the Israelites saw it. They said to each other, what is this? But they didn't know what it was. He said, it's the bread the Lord is giving you to eat, et cetera, et cetera. And then you said it's down to 20.
It was right there.
They must gather enough just for the day's need.
Yeah, they must and keep part of it till morning.
And it was full of maggots and began to smell. Moses was angry with them.
Look, what we need is we need a Jewish comedian who can interpret this for us, because this is, you think about this, okay, we read the very serious documents from the Torah, right? Very, very serious. These, it's almost like God is sitting on a comedy show here, right? Yes, sir.
The point you made when we went through the Torah just really struck home with me, that they had been slaves for 400 years, and that God was using this time in the wilderness to slap them around a little bit and say, wake up, you're not slaves anymore. You need to start thinking for yourself and following what I instruct you to do.
Yeah, and what's funny, and we should, I think, find this as really entertaining and funny, but we need to epicorinthi ourselves, right? And here's just a thought for the day. It's like the homework, right? We want to talk about history. We don't care necessarily about theology, but we want to see what the words say. But the thing that matters a lot in this is exactly what you're saying. Notice though, it says the point of a manna is so that you will follow my instructions. So if you follow my instructions, you have manna, you have quail. It's nice. It's a good meal. But if you don't, what happens? Maggots and smell. Like I said, we really need a Jewish comedian. You need a whole comedy routine based on this, because this is really funny when you think about it, right? Of course, maybe they're starving in the wilderness and they're worried about it, but still, they're fed. They're fat. They're happy, right? You think the same thing with the 5,000. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you, Lord, for this day. We pray that you look at us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
The problem is they pay no attention. They flunked the test.
They flunked the test.
And they were hungry.